Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Hello and welcome to the program for August 10th, 2021, which in the Hebrew calendar is the 2nd of Elul, 5781. It differs because it is a lunar solar calendar, which means that months are based on lunar months of 29 days alternating with 30 days, but years are based on solar years. An extra month is intercalated every 3 years based on a cycle of 19 years. I thought you'd like to hear that. I am Walter Bingham and look forward to spending the next hour in your company. My number for today is 10, the explanation at the end. Last week, the program deviated from the usual magazine style, but I hope that you found the single subject informative. Today we are back in the usual format, talking about coffee and also about my experience at a whisky tasting, with intensive explanations by an expert about every facet of the many varieties of this amber nectar. If you like whisky, you can't afford to miss this. And if whisky is not your favorite alcoholic drink, you will still be fascinated by what you hear. But I begin with a subject that has made headlines. Our Olympic gold medalist and his marriage plans frustrated by Israeli law. Does a superb sporting achievement that brought glory to our country override halakha, our religious code? That is the suggestion of those members of Israeli society for whom Judaism and our culture is a tribal tradition, rather than the lifestyle of a people that lives by Torah law. There is no question that Artem Dolgopyat is a national hero. To bring home a gold medal from the Olympic Games in Tokyo is a tremendous achievement, of which not only he, but the entire country can be very proud. We look forward to his return and the celebration for him and for the other medal winners. Artem belongs to the large number of immigrants from the former Soviet Union for whose release to move to Israel under the law of return, enacted in 1950, Jews worldwide campaigned. Keep it here, there's more.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
Artem belongs to the immigrants from the former Soviet Union for whose release to move to Israel Jews worldwide campaigned. That law grants every Jew, wherever he may be, the right to immigrate to Israel and become an Israeli citizen. For the purposes of this law, Jew means a person who was born of a Jewish mother or who has converted to Judaism and is not a member of another religion. In 1970, the law was amended to grant the right of return to anyone with one Jewish grandfather, whether matrilineal or patrilineal, and regardless of their own belief, as well as to their non-Jewish married spouses. This controversial change was based on the Nuremberg laws enacted by the Nazis in 1935, which determined that a person with even one Jewish grandfather is a Jew, with the prescribed consequences including the cancellation of citizenship and withdrawal of certain rights. It is scandalous that Jewish law of immigration should be based on Nazi doctrine without even definitive proof. Applications for immigration by so-called non-halachic Jews should be considered on an individual basis rather than a blanket dispensation. In the late 1980s, when the government of Mikhail Gorbachev opened the borders of the USSR and allowed Jews to leave the country, nearly 1 million Soviet Jews and their non-Jewish relatives and spouses immigrated to Israel between 1989 and 2006. According to the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics, 26% of those immigrants were not considered Jewish by Orthodox interpretation of Jewish law. That created great difficulties with the Chief Rabbinate of Israel, which by the law of 1980 is recognized as the only rabbinic authority for Judaism in Israel and has sole control over the regulations of marriage, so that only approved religious leaders can perform marriage. Israeli law does not permit civil marriages. On the express pronouncement of his mother, Artem Dolgopiat is not Jewish because she is not Jewish. Now our Olympic hero wants to marry but finds no sympathy in Israel's laws. Because of the high profile gained by his Olympic achievement, the powers of Israel's chief rabbinate are again being questioned. Not as you might think by the protagonist himself, who is adversely affected by the law. No, he keeps a low profile as if reluctantly accepting the situation. The movement to change the law is stirred by the high school dropout and foreign minister Yair Lapid, whose knowledge of halakha, religious law, fits onto a small postage stamp. There is no question that Artem Dolgopiat is a national hero. To bring home a gold medal from the Olympic Games in Tokyo is a tremendous achievement, of which not only he, but the entire country can be very proud. We look forward to his return and the celebration for him and for the other medal winners. In order for a Jewish wedding in Israel to be recognized by the state, it must be carried out under the auspices of Israel's chief rabbinate. The chief rabbinate operates according to Orthodox halakha, Jewish law, which specifies various requirements and prohibitions regarding marriage. Civil marriages performed outside of Israel are recognized for the purpose of national statistics, but not personal status. Similarly, common law marriages afford couples some marriage-related rights and protections, but not full recognition. According to reports, Lapid said that, quote, "It is intolerable that someone can fight on our behalf in the Olympics, win a gold medal, and not get married in Israel. No, Minister, it is arrogant and disdainful to equate even a great achievement in sport with our old-age Torah laws." As Knesset member Aryeh Deri remarked, winning a medal does not make him Jewish. Aided by the post-Zionist government, there are dark forces at work that are aiming to transform the Jewish state, finally established after 2,000 years in the wilderness, into a country for Jews based on tribalist traditions. The founding of a private organization to rival the chief rabbinate for all its functions, including establishing questionable Jewish roots to enable marriage, is the beginning of the loss of the Jewish identity of our beloved Jewish state. It is the thin end of the wedge. If you were to guess the origin of coffee, you'd probably say Brazil or Colombia or some other South American country. Surprise, surprise, it really originates in Ethiopia. This foreign culture of drinking coffee has made it big in Israel. It's that thick brown liquid sold in many establishments, from international franchise shops to kiosks and supermarkets to gas stations, usually dispensed in throwaway paper cups and topped with froth, produced by infusing milk with hot steam. The taste is potluck. Just as the fast pace of today's life has accustomed us to get used to fast food like burgers or ready-made chicken or tuna salads that would never be seen on the menu of a gourmet restaurant, so in most homes the coffee is made from freeze-dried powder or granules that dissolve instantly in hot water, producing the liquid to which we refer, in my view not totally justified, as coffee. Soluble coffee originated in the early 1900s, but the version sold today was perfected in 1963. The history of coffee dates back to the 15th century, as is clearly shown in an exhibition at the Museum of Islamic Art at number 2 Hapalmach Street, Jerusalem. Fascinated by the subject of coffee, the curator of this project, Yael Schäfer, worked for 5 years collecting items from 25 countries covering different coffee cultures from all over the world that illustrate the history of the use of coffee through the ages to this present day. I visited this extraordinary exhibition, and my guide was the very knowledgeable Genia, whose expertise made this subject of coffee culture extremely interesting. Coffee came to Europe through Yemen and its port of Mocha on the Red Sea coast, hence Mocha entered the vocabulary of coffee. Its journey took it via the Ottoman Empire, and the exhibition displays a number of items on loan from Turkish collections. During the 18th century, Turkish individuals brought their own personal cup to the coffee house. A number of those cups on display show clearly the various status of their owners by the way they are decorated and the material used. Here's my guide talking about coffee culture in the Ottoman Empire.
Here you'll see some interesting things. For example, a coffee cup here, which has sort of a placement, a metallic opening, where people used to put opium. Since opium is, of course, a substance that is looked upon as something negative, it would be hidden within the coffee cup. Since coffee culture won't be very much of a positive thing, but it would not be seen as negatively as opium, and you have the opium being hidden within the coffee cup. On the other hand, you can look at it in a much more stylish way and less problematic. For example, if you look at the cup right here, custom made for customer, it's bigger, and you see it is actually made in order to protect the person's mustache while you're drinking coffee. So coffee is, on the one hand, already an emblem of high status, but it's also an emblem of some sort of decadence, because it's being looked upon as problematic by the religious leadership, both Muslims and Christians and Jews. But on the other hand, it is already becoming part of ingrained culture, and of course, when you are of high status or high class, coffee drinking itself becomes a practice of that kind of class, just like smoking.
What you heard so far was only a taster of the history of coffee. This extensive exhibition helps to understand the coffee cultures in different parts of the world with the aid of utensils used to make this nectar of the nations. Also on display are relatively modern products connected with the art of drinking coffee produced in Israel, and finally commercial coffee-making machines from upright steam-powered pressure cylinders to the latest oblong electric appliances seen today in coffee shops. If coffee is your daily beverage and you live in or visit Israel, then this exhibition should be on your itinerary. It is scheduled to run until the end of the year. More information about the Museum of Islamic Art in Jerusalem can be found on their website. As you know, I've been around for a good few years and traveled the world. I've also had a few tots of whiskey in my time. Of course, that does not mean that I'm an authority, just a normal guy who likes a dram of single malt once in a while. I know that there are more varieties of that amber liquid that I have ever seen, because I didn't look very far until this week, when I was introduced to a pundit who knows more about this subject than I shall ever learn.
Hi, I'm Steve Miller.
And I'm Matt Zucker.
Join us for Lighten Up, where we take a look at the week's current events in Israel and from around the Jewish world through a humorous lens.
If you've been paying attention during these crazy times, you know that it's a challenge to parody life anymore. But join Steve and I as we give it the old college try. Not only is being happy an obligation, but life is just too short to take it all so seriously.
So join me, Steve Miller,
And me, Matt Zucker,
for Lighten Up every Monday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. Israel, only on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
And now, here is Walter Bingham.
I know that there are more varieties of that amber liquid that I have ever seen, because I didn't look very far until this week, when I was introduced to a pundit who knows more about this subject than I shall ever learn. So you will probably picture a Scot in his senior years with a red-tipped nose, twisted moustache, and suitably attired in the tartan of his clan. Well, you couldn't be more wrong. That expert is 25-year-old chemistry student Eyal Appelbaum, an 11th generation Yerushalmi who lives among his hobby, a vast collection of every kind of whiskey that I think has ever been distilled. When I found out about him, I had to see that for myself to make sure that I haven't misheard. So I went to visit his home in Jerusalem. Whiskey lovers, don't touch any buttons, because you wouldn't want to miss a second of this fascinating story. The moment I entered Eyal's living room, I was greeted with an alluring aroma of that amber nectar. So welcome to the program, Eyal Appelbaum, and thank you for inviting me to your home.
Thank you for coming.
What I read about your collection did certainly not do it justice. How many bottles of different whiskies are you displaying in this large showcase?
We are currently standing at around 241 different bottles.
Is each bottle is different?
Yes, each bottle is different.
I didn't realize that there are so many varieties. Now, you're just 25 years old. Did you begin this as a hobby, and why?
I started this more on the intellectual side. I study chemistry and material engineering, and I've always liked alcohol. I've been a bartender for a long while, and I kind of decided to merge together my hobby with alcohol and my studies, and whiskey does that the best, in my opinion. I always like saying that whiskey is the perfect combination of art and science.
What I see is so overwhelming that it's really hard to know where to begin with my questions. So give me first an overview of what you've got here.
Right here we have all the Scotch, specifically areas of Islay Scotch, which is the peated version, smoked. We also have the Irish and World whiskey. I have some bourbons, but mostly bottles of Scotch. It's around 200 bottles of Scotch.
Is that all made in Scotland?
Yes.
Scotch, by the name, should be from Scotland, but I understand that there are other whiskies.
Most of my collection is actually Scotch, whiskey made in Scotland, aged at least 3 years. But I do have some Israeli whiskey, some Eastern whiskey, which is Indian and Taiwanese. I have a lot of bourbon and Irish whiskey, Ireland being the source of whiskey in general. But it's mostly Scotch because that's what I enjoy drinking the most.
As you just explained, I suppose almost everybody would associate this drink with Scotland. But you're mentioning countries that one would never associate with whiskey. How many countries are represented here?
Represented here are about 12 countries at the moment. I'm working on expanding that. Over 30 countries that I know of are making great whiskey. For instance, Germany, France, India, Japan, Taiwan.
They also make whiskey in Japan. I thought that's sake.
Yeah, they also make great sake, but they do make whiskey. They started in 1905 by learning from the Scots, and from there they kind of took over the industry.
I know that age is a determining factor of quality. Does that mean my bottle of Johnny Walker gets better if I keep it longer?
No, whiskey does not age in a bottle. It can rot the cork if you're not careful, so don't keep it on the side. But whiskey does not age once it leaves the barrel.
Standing at a bar, one often sees people diluting their alcoholic drink with tonic or ice. How does that affect your beloved whiskey?
It does affect the whiskey. It affects the experience. But what I like to say is that anyone can enjoy the whiskey the way they want to enjoy it. As long as you're having fun, if you want to mix it with tonic water or ice or soda or ginger ale goes very well. I'd suggest the cheaper blends maybe, so as not to ruin the experience and tastes and smells of a single malt that will otherwise be masked by the Coca-Cola, for example.
What are the main ingredients of whiskey and what determines the variety of tastes? So give me some examples.
There are 4 ingredients in whiskey. There can be only 4, which is the water, the yeast, the grain, because it's a distillate made from grain, and the wood from the oak containers, the oak barrels that hold it. I say that the wood is part of the ingredients because at higher alcohol contents, around 60%, where the whiskey ages in the oak, it eats up some of the cells of the oak, and that's how it gets its color and texture and some of its aroma. The grain is going to make a huge difference on what whiskey we're making. If it's single malt, everywhere except in the United States, it means it's from 100% malted barley, distilled with a pot still, which is the old school way of distilling, which is another factor that can change the taste and texture of a whiskey. Other than that, the barrel is going to make a huge difference depending if it's used or new and what was in it before.
They wouldn't use barrels for that, would they, where wine was in there before?
Yes, they actually do. One of my favorite barrels is a Madeira barrel, which is made in the Madeira Island. They not use the wine barrels to age the whiskey after to give it that extra flavor.
Make it sweet?
It makes it sweeter, more chocolatey. It gives aromas of pecan maybe and cinnamon.
I look forward to that. What are the different ways of distilling the alcohol?
There are many different ways to distill. It boils down to, funny word to use, but it boils down to the boiling point of the liquid that we're trying to distill, which is for alcohol at 78.37. There are a couple of stills, a couple of options to use. You can use pot stills, which are the traditional way of distilling. By the way, and this is an interesting tidbit, the first alembic pot still that was hand-drawn, alembic, that's the Arabic word for it. They use it in cognac. They don't use that word anymore in whiskey. But the first pot still that was mentioned in any writing is from a Jewish woman by the name of Maria Yehudia, or Maria the Jewess, Maria the Prophet, they used to call her. She lived in the 2nd century. She was a Jewish alchemist in Alexandria. So that's the first kind of still. There are many different varieties of it.
What did she distill?
She tried to distill what alchemists try to make, which is main ingredient that makes up everything in our world. They thought that it's a specific kind of metal. They tried making gold out of everything. Little did they know it's actually iron that is the most stable element. But they mostly distilled what they got was sulfur. Because copper, and that's a big reason why single malts use pot stills made of copper, because copper reacts very well with sulfur. I do like my sulfur in my whiskey. The sixth we're going to try by Yerushalmi, which is a distillery right next to Jerusalem. They do like their sulfur in there, so they make it the smallest copper pot still possible, as to not come in contact with the copper so much. But copper does take the sulfur away from the whiskey. It's a very good catalyst.
As I listened to Eyal Applebaum, I realized more and more that socializing while absent-mindedly taking an occasional sip of whiskey is like walking through the 18th century street without noticing the exquisite architecture of the buildings.
One of the reasons I like doing these whiskey tastings so much is because you can combine it. You can socialize and appreciate the whiskey.
Tell me about the professional side of your whiskey tasting, because I know you go out to, if you're invited, to different venues professionally and give a talk about whiskey. How does that work?
Yes, so I come to the customer's home for small groups of recommended 6 to 8 up to 12 people. And I bring everything with me. I bring the snack, homemade chocolates, cheese to go with the whiskey, because one of the main things in whiskey is getting past the sense of alcohol, the pain that ethanol, when it reacts with our tongue.
Ethanol, can you explain that?
Ethanol is the main molecule of alcohol. It's the one that makes us drunk. It's the one we can consume moderately safely, and the one that affects our brain the most. It's at least 40% of every whiskey on Earth.
What kind of venues are there that you go to? Who's the customer?
That's a very broad range. I have students that want to know a little bit more about whiskey. I have a lot of people celebrating birthdays from all over Israel. It's usually people who are a little older.
When you have a group of 10 people, does everybody get whiskey to drink? That's an expensive business.
Yes, it is an expensive business. I do it to do what I love doing. Yes, everybody gets 6 samples of whiskey, which are about 45 milliliters. It's a lot of whiskey. And we talk about it for an hour and a half. We taste it together. I tell stories about specific whiskeys and just stories about whiskey in general.
I can understand you carrying 6 bottles, but what about glasses?
I have a special suitcase custom made for me that has room for enough glasses, both water and the whiskey glasses.
Are you tired of political correctness and the fear that you might offend someone?
I'm not afraid to offend you.
Wow, look who's talking tough.
One has to be tough to keep sane today.
Hi, I'm Alan Skorsky.
And I'm Bela Seabrow.
And join us every Wednesday for The Definitive Wrap as we interview the most sought-after guests and expose progressive trends that masquerade as enlightenment but actually destroy our freedoms.
We are the No Woke Zone, so buckle up to this exciting show.
Buckling up, but I'm driving.
Sure, you can drive, but I'm the navigator.
Tune in for the No Nonsense, The Definitive Wrap Show, every Wednesday on Israel News Talk Radio.
I have a special suitcase custom made for me that has room for enough glasses and glass caps.
I mean, the glass is covered.
Yes. We don't want the aromas to mix together, so you can focus on one. And we want to pour them all together so as not to take up time during the workshop itself. So I had these custom made as well.
I now have been invited to a master class in whiskey tasting. So how do I need to prepare myself to get the full benefit of the various flavors?
First of all, I always recommend coming on a full stomach and drinking water. Other than that, have fun with the whiskey and try to remember that taste is very subjective. So during the workshop, I can describe the whiskey the way I smell it and I taste it. So I can say it tastes like vanilla and smells like green apples. It doesn't necessarily mean that you or anyone has to taste that same molecule. We can identify over 200 different molecules in whiskey that are responsible for different aromas. If you smell something, it's probably correct. So there's no wrong answer when tasting and smelling. So my biggest tip is to come with an open mind and be confident with what you taste. So in front of us, we have 6 different whiskeys. 5 of them are single malt from 4 different countries. I put a bourbon in there. The first one is Irish. The second one is Scotch. The fourth one is Taiwanese. Fifth one is Scotch again. And the last one is Israeli, the Yerushalmi. We have some cheese here. Well, the reason I bring cheese with a higher content of fatty molecules, because ethanol can go through our protective fatty cells in our tongue and hit the pain receptors. That's why alcohol burns. If you cover it with fat that is not from our body, but from cheese, or maybe even if you're a vegan coconut oil, then the alcohol doesn't burn as much because it can't penetrate it. I do have homemade chocolates here, just because chocolate goes well with whiskey, I found. So we're going to start with an Irish single malt called Waterford. I'll try to describe to you while you smell it. What I like about this glass is that it's not as open as a lowball glass. It's got a smaller opening and a wider base for the alcohol to stay in, while the aroma and the molecules that are responsible for them can come up to our nose, because not many people know this, but whiskey is actually lightly carbonated. It has CO2 in it, and some of it doesn't leave the whiskey until it goes into our glass. So a lot of the molecules that are responsible for the aromas are fatty molecules. They're afraid of water. They're hydrophobic. They get carried upwards. They try to get away from the water to our nose with CO2. What I like doing is bringing the glass to my nose until it starts to sting, and then take it a little bit back. What I find helps is people always look at me weird when I say it, but it's true. Smelling with your mouth a little open as to allow the circulation of the alcohol to waft through. This whiskey, like the 5 other single malts, is made from 100% malted barley.
How do I hold the glass?
There is no right way to hold it. I like holding it from the base as to not warm the whiskey. It's not cognac, and its aroma is strong enough. You don't need to help it evaporate. Usually we do a shot before we taste, because the first sip of whiskey is going to be the roughest. It burns the most because of what is called the retronasal effect. It's where alcohol that comes in contact with our body evaporates from our stomach and builds up behind our sinuses. So the retronasal effect helps us smell other aromas that aren't alcohol. So the first taste is going to be, yeah, that's whiskey. But once we continue, I hope that we'll find together different aromas and different texture from the different whiskeys that we're going to try today. So the first thing I look at is the color of the whiskey.
The first one is very light. It's not as amber.
This is a young whiskey, which means it wasn't as aged, and as we know, age gives the whiskey a color. That's right in Ireland. In Israel, for example, or Taiwan, which is the whiskey that I showed you to compare, the whiskey gets its colors a lot quicker because during age, the barrel contracts and expands and works like a sponge, taking the whiskey in, pushing it back out. And while it's doing that motion from the changes in temperature, that's how the whiskey interacts with the wood chemically and ages.
Is it like wine kept in cellars? Because then you have a more even temperature.
It's not kept in cellars. The traditional way is called a dunnage, It's only half underground, so the roof does get airflow and changes in temperature. So it has to be different than wine. Now we can take a sniff and think, is it sweet? Is it sour? And if it's sour, then is it fruit sour or more acidic? The molecule that is most common in whiskey is vanillin. It gives the aroma of vanilla. The percentages in alcohol just means how much ethanol is in the bottle. Whiskey, when it comes off the still before it's aged, comes around between 60 to 80% alcohol. And it gets diluted with water before it enters the barrel. Because what we do want is the alcohol to react with the wood, because the wood gives us a lot of acid. When an acid and an alcohol meet, they make different taste compounds called nutty aroma, like hazelnuts or pecan. And once the whiskey is aged, it's diluted again to usually the minimal amount, which is 40% alcohol. Sometimes in newer distilleries or newer editions, they're starting to get back to what is called cask strength, which means not to dilute the whiskey after it ages. So it can come from low 50s to high 60%. The percentage to be legally called whiskey is 40.
Having absorbed all the information and taking note of the instructions, I began tasting. The first one, the 3-year-old pale but very strong Irish whiskey. True to Eyal's prediction, this is my reaction to the first sip. Strong stuff.
The next whiskey we're going to try is a limited edition Glenmorangie.
And so I tasted one after another, small sips, I can assure you, while Eyal was explaining what exactly they were and how they were made. At my request, the little portions of whiskey I'm tasting are being reduced in size. And I just wonder, when you go out on tastings, do people actually finish each of the glasses?
Usually, yes. A lot of people end up drunk after the tastings.
The last one of the 6 that I am tasting is the one I like best. It's a Yerushalmi whiskey from a distillery just outside Jerusalem. It's a single malt named Mount Moriah, and they don't call it whiskey. Why?
Because Israel liked the way the Scots do it, that under 3 years they don't call it whiskey. It's 1 year and 4 months, if I'm not mistaken. A lot younger than what we've tasted so far, but in my opinion, a great whiskey.
I wholeheartedly agree. It was the one that I enjoyed. Very smoky, and congratulations to that distillery, and would recommend.
It's a great up-and-coming distillery in Moshav Zanoach. It's right next to Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem mountains.
I think that's an achievement for Israel.
Our whiskey industry is growing rapidly. The first 2 distilleries opened around 2014, and all distilleries from Israel, which are 4 in total, are making award-winning whiskey. One of the whiskeys by Milk and Honey, a distillery in Jaffa, which made the classic Milk and Honey, became one of the top 20 whiskeys of 2020.
Eyal, thank you very much for educating me about whiskies. Now, back to current affairs. For several months now, we read and heard reports that Iran is soon reaching the breakout point to be able to produce nuclear weapons. Israel is at the forefront of warning the Western world of the danger of an unstable terrorist regime to become nuclear. Iran is showing almost daily its intention to achieve hegemony over the larger Middle East, and that Israel, its main stumbling block, must be eradicated from the face of the earth. It is already proving that it controls the Straits of Hormuz, in the waterway that provides the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, by attacking shipping at will. Western countries took little notice because they were not affected and did not want to further damage commerce with Iran. Until last week, when the tanker Mercer Street was the target of a suspected Iranian drone attack that killed a British and a Romanian crew member. It is sad that it took fatalities to drive home to the business-oriented countries that their short-term objectives may end in world war unless Iran is prevented to achieve its nuclear ambition. Results of Israel's past intelligence activities in Iran prove beyond doubt that their leaders intend to reach their military ambitions with nuclear weapons if necessary. This week, our Defense Minister Benny Gantz disclosed to a group of diplomats from Security Council member states that Iran will reach nuclear breakout in 10 weeks. It is not only Israel that is threatened, but the world. Gantz said that if there is still an international community, then this is the time for them to act. Our government has stated more than once that if there is no combined international operation, economically or, if necessary, military, against Iran's nuclear threat, Israel reserves the right to take any action to ensure her security. So far, not even the latest attacks on the freedom of navigation on the high seas attributed to Iran has produced an international response other than statements, while the Iranian regime, now under the presidency of extreme hardliner Ebrahim Raisi, is laughing all the way to the bank. Now for something totally different. Far away from modern politics, I want to tell you about the interesting relationship between Jews and Native American Indians. Not a great deal is written or even known today about the cooperation of Jews with Native American Indians. It is, however, a fascinating subject. There is much nostalgia about the affinity of Jews and Jewish history with that of American Indian tribes. The atrocities inflicted upon their people resulted in diminishing their population by 90%, from a high of about 10 million in 1492 to a low of 250,000 at the beginning of the 20th century, but their numbers are slowly recovering. According to a report in Ynet, a population of Native American Indians from the U.S. state of Colorado has been found to have a genetic mutation typical of Ashkenazi Jews. The finding suggests the presence of common roots that date back to the days of Christopher Columbus. Several stories circulate on this subject. In 1650, Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, chief rabbi of Amsterdam, recorded in his book Mikveh Israel a conversation that he had with a Jewish Dutch explorer of the Americas. The explorer related how he made contact with the Native Americans, but after trying to communicate with them in every possible European language, he had no success. Both he and his first mate being Jewish, they began to talk amongst themselves in Hebrew. To his utter amazement, upon hearing them speak Hebrew, the Native American chief responded by saying, Shema Israel. In 1775, Englishman James Adair, after living with Native Americans for 40 years, recorded his experiences and published a book about them in London entitled The History of the American Indians. Almost his entire work is dedicated to document and prove that the Native American tribes of the Central and Southern Territories were definitely of Jewish origin, and to this day maintained a sizable amount of their ancient Israelite heritage. Among the points of similarity between the Jews and Indians, Adair emphasized the division into tribes, notions of theocracy, of ablutions and uncleanliness, cities of refuge, and practices as regards divorce. He goes so far as to say that the tribes he knew worshipped a single God whom they called in their language Yehovah. Even President Thomas Jefferson in 1803 was aware of Adair's book and made mention of it in one of his letters to John Adams. Jefferson quotes Adair's belief that all the Indians of America are descended from the Jews. They have the same laws, usages, rites, and ceremonies, the same sacrifices, priests, prophets, fasts, and festivals, almost the same religion, and that they all spoke Hebrew. It was in the 19th century when the 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, appointed Dr. Hermann Bendel, a Jewish doctor from New York, as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. Because he was a Jew, the newspaper, the Boston Pilot, feared that Dr. Bendel would undo the good work of Christian missionaries and start spreading Judaism among Arizona's Native Americans. In fact, Bendel's Judaism was one of the reasons that President Grant appointed him, because he wanted someone who would not prioritize missionary work. Dr. Bendel quickly emerged as the champion of native rights within the government. He wrote, "I feel it is a duty I owe to the people of the country and the Indians under my charge to do something to relieve the pressures that surround them." There was continuous intense opposition to Dr. Bendel's Jewish faith that made his job impossible, so that after 2 years he resigned, returned to Albany, married his childhood sweetheart Wilhelmina Levy, and practiced medicine. In a Walterswell program some time ago, Rabbi Cooper, dean of the Wiesenthal Center, said that anti-Semitism in America was nothing new. Well, here we have the proof from the 19th century. When Dr. Bendel died in 1932, few people realized that this long-time New York State ophthalmologist had once worked to secure Indian rights in pre-state Arizona. Then there was the story of Julius Meyer, who as a teenager in 1866 moved from his birthplace in Prussia to Omaha, some time before Omaha was incorporated as a city and Nebraska was admitted to the Union as a state. He joined his older brothers, Max, Moritz, and Adolf, who had founded a cigar store and a jewelry and music store. Young Julius found his own niche and traded the cigars and jewelry from their stores with Native American tribes. He would travel on horseback deep into Indian-controlled territory, living for weeks with Native American tribes and traders. Julius Meyer spoke several native tongues. That set him apart from many European traders. He also treated Native Americans fairly, earning him the sobriquet Boxkare Shah Hashtaka, meaning curly-haired white chief who speaks with one tongue, a reference to his curly hair and also his straight, honest way of doing business. Despite living with Native Americans for weeks at a time, Julius was known to be keeping Jewish dietary laws, so that when he was invited to feasts with tribesmen, his hosts knew to serve him hard-boiled eggs instead of the non-kosher meat that everyone else enjoyed. Back in Omaha, Julius set up a popular Indian wigwam store, selling Indian-made items. In 1909, at the age of 60, he died in mysterious circumstances. It was reported as a suicide that he shot himself first in the temple, then in the chest with his left hand. But he was right-handed. No alternative theory was ever put forward, and he was mourned throughout the American West as a tragic case of suicide. In 1869, another teenager from Prussia arrived in America and settled in the New Mexican town of Ceboleta to join two of his older brothers who had come to the United States some years before. He was Solomon Bebo. Like most Jews in the American West, the Bebo brothers worked as traders, but they were far from ordinary. Unlike many Europeans at the time, they quickly garnered a reputation of fairness and honesty when dealing with Native Americans. Solomon Bebo quickly learned Keresan, the language of the local Acoma tribe, and immersed himself in their concerns, championing Acoma rights against Mexican and American ranchers, and against the U.S. government, which he accused of trying to cheat the Acoma out of their rightfully owned lands. As a result, in 1877, the U.S. government offered the Acoma a treaty guaranteeing the tribe 94,000 acres of land, far less than they felt they deserved. So in order to protect their remaining lands, the Acoma leased their land to Bebo for 30 years, in exchange for an annual payment of $12,000 and assurances that Bebo would protect the land from squatters, ensure that coal on the tribe's land was mined, and that the tribe would receive the proceeds. Learning of the agreement, an Indian agent from Santa Fe, Pedro Sanchez, wrote to the Commission of Indian Affairs complaining about Bebo, the rich Jew, and tried to get the lease invalidated on grounds that the tribe as a whole had not agreed to the agreement. Bebo found himself facing not only the loss of the Acoma lease, but the loss of his trader's license as well. The Acoma nation quickly mobilized itself, providing a petition with 100 signatures to the Bureau of Indian Affairs asserting that they had confidence in Bebo. Eventually, Solomon Bebo married Juliana Valle, the granddaughter of the Acoma chief, and he later became chief of the nation himself, pushing for educational and infrastructure reforms, and Joanna began to adopt a Jewish lifestyle. But 2 years before the turn of the century, Solomon and Joanna moved to San Francisco in order to provide their 6 children with a Jewish education. Solomon died in 1934 and Joanna in 1941. Their children said Kaddish for them. Then there was Wolf Kalischer, who in 1826 moved from Poland to Los Angeles and 29 years later became a United States citizen. After the Civil War, he and Henry Wartenberg started a tannery, one of that city's first factories. Kalischer went out of his way to hire Native American workers and championing Native American rights. At the same time, he became a pillar of the developing Los Angeles Jewish community, and with his wife Louise raised their 4 children and helped establish one of the city's first synagogues. He became particularly close with Manuel Olegario, a leader of the local Temecula tribe, advising and assisting the chief as he campaigned to protect his tribe's land in San Diego County. Kalischer Street in Los Angeles memorizes Wolf Kalischer and his efforts on behalf of Native Americans. But not all Jewish businessmen used their connection with American Native Indians to further the interest of the tribes or even to mutual advantage. Otto Meers was born in Kurland, Russia, on the 3rd of May 1840 to an English father and a Russian mother. His parents were both Jewish, but otherwise little is known about them. After a troubled childhood, and in his early teens, he arrived in San Francisco to join an uncle who lived there, and it was the height of the gold rush, and young Otto soon found himself practicing successful financial speculation. At the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, he joined the California Volunteers and took part in several actions, including the Army's campaign against the Navajo, which was led by Kit Carson in 1863-64. Following that episode, he moved north to become a merchant, which brought him into contact with the Ute Indians. He learned their language and, so it is reported, spoke it with a Yiddish accent. Mears saw an opportunity to exploit that relationship and managed to obtain U.S. government contracts. Through his government connections, he became involved in the infamous Brunot Agreement between the U.S. government and the Ute to cede some of their land. Otto Mears acted as advisor to Chief Kure, the unofficial Ute negotiator. Mears' interest, however, was to take over the vast area, and he played a key role in the removal of the Ute tribe of Colorado from their land on which they lived for more than 400 years, according to the Colorado Encyclopedia. He used the land to build miles of railroad and more than 450 miles of toll roads across Ute-owned land to facilitate his many business interests, including the Mears Transportation Company. His transportation empire transformed southern Colorado. Today, about half of the 4,000 members of the Ute tribe live on the reservation in northeastern Utah, the second largest in the United States, covering about 4.5 million acres according to one report, but 1.2 million according to other documents. A stained glass window situated directly above the entrance to the Colorado State Chamber is Colorado's monument to Otto Mears. Does he deserve it? In New Jersey, Santos Hawksblood Suarez is an Apache activist who brings fellow Native Americans to pro-Israel events. He insists that there are strong parallels between Native Americans and Jews. Both groups have lived in exile. Jews show that it's possible for a native people to return to their native land and revive the ancestral language even after thousands of years. He said, "I admire the people who take a stand. That's why I admire the people of Israel. They are people who stand up to defend their homeland," said Suarez. The first female chief of the Rappahannock tribe in Virginia is Chief Ann Richardson. She is also a strong supporter of the Jewish state. In 2013, she and another female chief, Kathy Cummings Dickinson of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, visited Israel. Wearing their ceremonial robes, the chiefs brought this message to the government. "We are here to deliver a message to the residents of Israel. Stand firm and united against the threats and pressure. We want to encourage Israel not to give in to those who try to pressure them to give up parts of their homeland. Surrender to this pressure is not a recipe for peace, but rather war. We stand beside you." Watching coverage of Israel's 60th Independence Day festivities in May 2008 was a revelation for David Sicki, the vice chairman of the governing council of the sovereign nation of the Coushatta tribe of Louisiana. After learning more about the Jewish state, he realized there were some incredible parallels between Israel and his own nation. When Sicki presented his idea to fostering relations between the Coushatta nation and Israel, his tribal chiefs were enthusiastic because the Coushatta value sovereignty and nationhood much like the Jewish people, and autonomy is something to be embraced. The then Israeli consul Asher Yarden visited the tribe for an official ceremony to establish formal ties. "It was a highlight, if not the highlight, of my 25-year career with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs," he explained. The Kushata adopted May 14, Israel's Independence Day, as a holiday called Stakayub Yanita Israel, meaning the day to honor Israel. A Kushata delegation visited Israel in 2009 to foster economic ties. The tribe is currently the American distributor of Ava Natural, an Israeli Druze-owned company that produces olive oil-based cosmetics in the north of Israel. Israeli engineers are also aiding Kushata fish farmers in importing high-tech Israeli fish farming technology. Siki said, Israel is a very dynamic nation, and it makes sense for the tribe to partner with a very robust nation and the only democracy in the region. Now, here is an interesting fact showing a different Jewish connection to American Indians. Researchers at Israel's Sheba Medical Center near Tel Aviv have found an unexpected link to Jews in a group of Native Americans living in Colorado. It is a genetic mutation that predisposes carriers to breast and ovarian cancer and is found disproportionately in Jews of Ashkenazi origin. Researchers conducted additional genetic testing and identified a common ancestor, a Jew who came to South America from Europe about 600 years ago, about the time that Jews were forced out of Spain and Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. The mutation among the Native American population is identical to that found among Ashkenazi Jews, offering solid proof of a long Jewish intermarriage with Native American tribes. After that, it is perhaps not surprising that American Indian tribes support the State of Israel, and I salute the American Indians. My number for this week referred to the 10 days that may influence the future of the Middle East. May the Lord guide our leaders to act in the best interests of our country and nation. As usual, I hope to be back again next week, same time, same place, with another selection of news, views, and interviews from Israel and the rest of the Jewish world. Until then, this is Walter Bingham, wishing you a meaningful month of Elul. As the COVID pandemic is still with us, the restrictions impose a heavy burden on the elderly. So please call on your elderly neighbor to see how they're doing. Even if you can only stand at the door, it will make all the difference to their day. Loneliness can be a killer. Goodbye.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.